Home buyers are furious, Wall Street's rattled, and Jerome Powell, he's not budging.
For the time being, we are well positioned to wait to learn more about the likely course of the economy before considering any adjustments to our policy stance.
Meanwhile, inventory is rising, demand is falling, affordability is breaking, and most people are starting to ask, is Jerome Powell actually tanking the housing market on purpose? In this video, I'm breaking down what's really going on, why Powell is holding the line, who's pressuring him to pivot, and why it could change everything for your future mortgage. But first, I want to talk about something I need to make absolutely clear, because it's one of the biggest points of confusion out there. The Federal Reserve does not set your mortgage rate, all right? Not directly, but it absolutely influences it. In fact, what the Fed does is like throwing a giant rock into a calm financial pond. Those ripples are gonna reach everything. When the Fed raises or lowers the federal funds rate, it immediately shifts expectations for everything else. Most importantly, it affects the 10-year Treasury yield. If investors expect the Fed to cut, yields tend to fall. If they think Powell's staying hawkish, yields stay high. So even though Powell doesn't touch the 30-year mortgage directly, his decisions send powerful signals through the entire system. You can see a strong correlation between the Fed funds rate and the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate. All right, it's not one-to-one, but it's close enough that when Powell speaks, your future monthly payment listens. So we talk about the housing market tanking, all right? Why is that? Well, affordability is a huge problem stalling out the housing market, and to understand how we got here, we need to look back because yes, Jerome Powell absolutely had a hand in this. If you take a look at this chart from the Texas Housing Affordability Index, I want you to see that the higher the number, the more affordable homes are. From 2014 to 2019, affordability was slowly deteriorating. But during the pandemic, there was a sudden spike. Housing suddenly became way more affordable. All right, well, why is that? Well, we all remember what happened then. The Fed slashed interest rates to near zero. That move flooded the market with cheap money, and almost immediately, inflation and home prices took off. But here's the problem. The Fed waited. Even as prices were soaring, they held off on acting. In her 2022 article, Gina Smialek describes how the Fed confronts why it may have acted too slowly on inflation. She wrote that some Federal Reserve officials have begun to acknowledge they were too slow to respond to rapid inflation. Right here we had inflation raging out of control all through 2021, and the Fed didn't raise rates until March 2022. But by then, the damage was done. Smialek continues saying how it became clear in early fall that fast inflation was proving to be more lasting, but the Fed pivoted toward rapidly removing policy support only in late November and did not raise rates until March. I want you to see what happened to Dallas home prices while the Fed waited and contemplated whether they should raise rates. The median home price jumped from $330,256 in September 2021 to $360,000 by March 2022 when the Fed finally acted. That is a 9% spike in just 6 months. All right, that kind of appreciation historically takes 2 to 3 years, but the Fed waited and buyers paid the price. Also, do you see how much damage can be done when the Fed waits even 6 months too long before acting? Fast forward to today, and pressure is building for Jay Powell to act, and once again, we see the Fed waiting. But let's take a look at exactly what Jay Powell is, or maybe I should say isn't, doing. Well, Daikon Hyatt with Investopedia writes, Fed Chair Powell holds firm on wait-and-see approach to rate cuts. The article then states that Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell told Congress Tuesday that the central bank can continue its waiting game. According to Investopedia, they are going to continue to hold rates flat until Fed officials have a better idea of what President Donald Trump's tariff policy will be and how the tariffs will affect consumer prices. So that's what the Fed is doing. So how are people responding to it? Well, Trump has been quite vocal about wanting a rate cut for a while, and he has not minced words when it comes to Powell.
So we have a stupid person, frankly, at the Fed. He probably won't cut today. Europe had 10 cuts, and we had none. And I guess he's a political guy. I don't know. He's a political guy who's not a smart person.
In his article, Daikon Hyatt explains a little bit more as to where Trump's coming from. He explains that Trump is pointing to recent economic data showing that inflation has been relatively tame in recent months. And I do want to touch on that for just a minute. The Fed funds rate, it doesn't have to be at one extreme or the other, right? So it doesn't need to be so low that it overheats the economy, nor so high that it chokes off growth. Ideally, we want it to be neutral. And that's why you're hearing about this collectively growing pressure and opposition to the Fed's policies. As of right now, the Fed has reached its dual mandate. PCE is currently at 2.1%, which is actually the lowest level in 7 months. Remember, the Fed has always said it wants inflation at 2%. And that's not the only goal we've met. In terms of employment and unemployment, the Fed says its goal is maximum employment, the highest level of employment or lowest level of unemployment that the economy can sustain while maintaining a stable inflation rate. Well, that's where we are. So in Trump's opinion, we have been restrictive long enough, and the numbers do appear to support that. Inflation is where Powell has long said he wants it to be, and employment is not causing inflation to grow. Now, and here's the real kicker. Even Powell agrees. I mean, he's not arguing with this. I just listened to what he has to say at the House Financial Services Committee.
You're right that if you just look in the rearview mirror and look at the existing data that we've seen, you can make a good argument that that would call for us to be at a neutral level, which would be, a couple of cuts or maybe more kind of thing.
So Powell knows where rates are right now are restrictive and not neutral, but now he's backpedaling. Like all this time, he has said he has a specific goal. Now that the goal is met, he's saying, well, actually, that's not enough. Essentially, what's going on here, okay, is that the Fed and various economists are worried that President Trump's tariffs will cause inflation. It hasn't showed up yet, but they feel that it will. In some of the articles I read, all right, it said we might not see the effects of those tariffs for another 6 months. And yet they want to hold steady in a restrictive posture until they know for sure what the tariffs will do. Well, to me, the question begs to be asked, why not hold steady in a neutral posture? So we know how Trump feels, but he is definitely not alone. Real estate tycoon Grant Cardone rips Fed Chair Powell for doing more damage to housing market. Cardone states that Jerome Powell has done more damage to the middle class and to housing in this country than any other single Fed or any decision that has ever been made out of Washington, D.C. Those are some strong words, but if you think about it, there is a valid argument there. The Fed let prices spiral out of control while delaying on raising rates, and now they're maintaining a restrictive policy when the time has come to hold a neutral posture. He's restricting in a way that is damaging the economy. If you were thinking this view may only come from Trump supporters, take a look and you'll see that Democrats are even joining Republicans in calling for rate cuts. Axios reports Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell told lawmakers on Tuesday that he is in wait-and-see mode on interest rates as Republicans and Democrats alike called for the Fed to make cuts soon. And what is it that they're saying? From our side, we'd love to see the rates go down. And I know a number of my colleagues on the other side would love to see the rates go down. I think it's pretty unanimous. But it's not just President Trump, Republicans, and Democrats. Even some of the Federal Reserve Board members have begun advocating a rate cut. Fox Business shares how Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller said in a Friday interview that he believes the central bank is in a position to start lowering rates starting next month. In fact, Waller even stated that he believes they are in the position to begin as soon as July. Axios comments on it saying that two top Fed officials who were appointed by Trump, as was Powell, said they supported rate cuts possibly as soon as July. The remarks by Fed Governors Christopher Waller and Michelle Bowman, those were a sharp break from the usual unison of the Board of Governors. Axios reports that Powell was asked by multiple lawmakers, including Republicans, whether he would support a July rate cut. So how did Powell respond? Well, he said, as long as the economy's strong, we can take a little bit of a pause. Waller's view is that the central bank shouldn't wait for a deterioration in the labor market to take action, arguing that if you're starting to worry about the downside risk to the labor market, move now, don't wait. Why do we want to wait until we actually see a crash before we start cutting rates? And I have to say, all right, he makes a very good point, because remember, everyone is advocating moving rates into neutral territory. Get the rates to where they're not harming the economy or the housing market for that matter. Everyone's waiting on Powell to make a move, but at what cost? The longer Powell holds the line, the louder the question becomes. What is the cost of waiting for our economy? U.S. News took a survey that found 4 out of 5 buyers are waiting to buy until rates drop. Meanwhile, Dallas home prices are doing all of the dropping. For example, ending in May, the median sales price in the entire DFW Metroplex was down 2.2%. In Collin County, they were down almost 5%. Dallas County median sales prices were down 4.3%. Denton prices were down 5.4%. Kaufman County is really struggling with a total decrease in median sales price of 8%. But let's zoom out for a second, because what's happening here isn't just about home prices. The Fed's decision to hold rates where they are is leading to something deeper. They're basically freezing up the housing market. And that's a much bigger deal than most people realize. When sellers can't afford to move and buyers can't afford to buy, everything stops moving. This lock-in effect creates a gridlocked economy. It traps families in homes that no longer fit their needs. It makes it harder for workers to relocate for jobs. It hurts small businesses that depend on home turnover. All right, so think movers, contractors, real estate agents, furniture stores, and it definitely stalls new construction demand. I mean, for example, many new construction builders have hit the pause button on expansion. With the lack of buyers and with lower prices, they can't recoup their costs. Dallas Morning News reports builders started 12,850 new homes during the first 3 months of the year, down 10.8% from the 2024 pace. That is going to result in fewer jobs for construction workers. I would say, though, that pre-owned home sellers are feeling this freeze the hardest. Unlike builders, they can't offer forward commitment rate cuts or flashy incentives. They're stuck competing in a stalled market with falling prices and no leverage. And it's starting to show. With buyers on the sidelines and prices slipping, more and more sellers are finding they can't sell. And even if they could, they'd walk away upside down on their mortgage. And it is a perfect storm of shrinking equity, rising pressure, and nowhere to go. So again, I hope you're seeing that this is restrictive, okay? They're freezing things up, where based on what Powell has been saying this whole time, we should be in a neutral posture right now. It should come as no surprise that foreclosures are beginning to creep up. Newswire shows that foreclosures are actually up both month over month and year over year. Just listen to these numbers. Lenders started the foreclosure process on 25,265 U.S. properties in April 2025, up 0.8% from last month and up 16.1% from a year ago. Texas is included in those states that had the greatest number of foreclosure starts in April 2025 with 3,280 foreclosure starts. Now, you'd have to keep in mind with stats like these that Texas is a lot bigger. So from that standpoint, it would stand to reason that there would be more, but still, that's no small number. As Powell holds firm, we're also seeing canceled contracts continuing to rise. If sellers can't sell, they can't go through with their new home purchases either, and they're forced to cancel their contracts. Redfin reported that in April, U.S. home purchases were canceled at the second highest April rate on record. They explained that home buyers are skittish for several reasons, including economic uncertainty, that it's a buyer's market, and of course, sticker shock over today's mortgage rates. Now, as much as Powell is restricting the economy, I do want to give you an alternative perspective. There are plenty of people out there who are downright giddy about the current housing market. They want home prices to plummet, and the Fed policy right now is restrictive enough to encourage prices going down. You have buyers out there saying they want to see prices drop by 30%. These individuals want to see rates stay the way they are or even increase in order to get there. Now, personally, the problem I see with that is that rates are not neutral right now. They are restrictive. Okay, if rates were neutral, I would be like, okay, let's let the housing market function with supply and demand. Let it do what it's going to do. The problem with the restrictive rate is the Fed ends up damaging the market. And then, next thing you know, it has to careen in the opposite direction. It's like what Waller said, why do we want to wait until we actually see a crash before we start cutting rates? So I personally, I would be very interested to know what the housing market would do with the Fed in neutral territory. Like, let's move it to neutral and let the housing market stabilize itself. Again, because the problem with restrictive rates is that then the Fed has to shift back into stimulating the economy, and home prices end up shooting back up again. The Fed's mandate is supposed to be price stability. So sure, dropping prices, right, plummeting prices, that may sound good to some buyers, but a stable market will always be better than a market that's rising and falling to extremes on both ends. Another angle, another perspective to consider is that buyers are a lot more empowered in this market. So you could call that a benefit too. In a buyer's market, you're given a strong negotiating position with plenty of homes to choose from. Plus, the sellers will see the need for a high marketing budget, meaning they'll be more willing to pay the buyer's realtor fees. And of course, you have motivated home builders. They are so motivated that they're willing to give you a lot of incentives. So you could call that a benefit as well. Many Dallas builders are in a lot of trouble. If you want to hear more about that, check out this video. In the meantime, this is Wendy Pinnell, and I will catch you on the next video.